Okay, tonight we're going to speak about social and economic and political reforms after independence in our newly independent colony. Our fundamental question for the day is that our leaders in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East have made a lot of promises on this path to independence. And the question is, can they keep these promises? How do they address the social and economic reforms that they said they would make prior to independence? Are they able to develop successful and prosperous countries, or do we see a cycle of instability? There are two major patterns, unfortunately. The first is authoritarian rule, and the second one relates, and it's a military coup d'etat. And so oftentimes when a military leader leads a fight, the military commanders tend to have stronger loyalty from their people than the leader of the country does, which makes sense. It's almost like a coach. It's somebody who's in the field with you, feeling the stress, leading by example, somebody you come to respect. And so oftentimes when these coups are carried out, it's the military commander who is suggested to become the new leader. An example of this would be George Washington in the United States. And sometimes it works, and other times the issue is that these leaders are great military strategists and powerful soldiers who inspire their peers, but they're not always the best political strategists. And so we end up with authoritarian rule, or a lot of times there are just other issues going on in the country that prevent these new leaders from having stable power and rule, like a divided religious sect, for example. So our first focus is on Ghana. And so the question is, what issues did Kwame Nkrumah run into while attempting to implement his socialist reforms that he promised in Ghana? And what was his response? So take a minute to think about it. See if you can make any connections. And there we see a statue of Nkrumah. So Nkrumah ran into problems, and his response was to grow more and more dictatorial and more totalitarian. He banned civilian political parties. He jailed his enemies when others suggested different forms of government. And Nkrumah held the support of the masses through staged events. So he would invent symbols and traditions and put statues up and try to create a sense of nationalism. But without a great deal of success. Switching to Egypt, you're asked to explain the progression of Egypt's last three leaders, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. How did each come to power, hold power, lose power, and what were the major impacts of each? And actually to this list, we can now add Mohamed Morsi, who was recently disposed from power. And so the trend in Egypt continues. And so it started out with Nasser. Right? And Nasser creates a dictatorship that intervenes in all aspects of life. He creates land reform. He finances education, which is great. Literacy skyrockets. There's more government jobs. Industrial growth plans for industrial growth, and restrictions on foreign investment. And a reminder to those who might have forgotten, foreign investment is outside companies from other countries come in and use your resources or land. So for example, sweatshops, Nike sweatshops in Indonesia, or Dole or Chiquita Banana, which is an American company, having crops and fields in Latin America. Remember, it gives jobs to the local people, there's infrastructure built, but a lot of the large profits leave the country, and the taxes leave the country. And so foreign investment is a temporary fix, but it's not a permanent solution. Nasser's foreign policy was to destroy the newly established Israeli state. So Israel becomes a target for Egypt, their neighbors. And Israel really is a target for most of the Middle East. Remember, it's made up of entirely Islamic nations besides Israel. And so Egypt also pushes Britain and France out of control of the Suez Canal. Remember that Egypt was a protectorate state? And so the question, why were so many of Nasser's reforms unsuccessful? Is because he didn't want foreign investment because he wanted independence, but Egypt didn't have what was necessary to grow its economy on its own. There was uncontrolled population growth, and so too many people without enough resources because, again, we lacked foreign investment, so not enough jobs, not enough food. And the reforms that were promised the state couldn't afford, which is a common problem, especially that newly communist nations. Then we have Iran, and you're asked to describe the role of Mohammad Mossadegh in the 20th century Iranian history, and describe how the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini represented a shift in the path of Iranian politics and culture. And I don't see a spot for this, but it does refer to the bottom three questions on the back side of your and I would take these notes. So Mossadegh was the prime minister of Iran from 51 to 53. The people chose him. They picked him, and he was a religious, not extremist, but he was a religious leader, more like a caliph, not quite, but and he didn't want to work with the United States, and so the CIA had him removed by a coup d'etat. And we put in a pseudo-king named Reza Shah. Shah means king. And Reza Shah was going to be friendly with us and do what we'd like. And under Reza Shah, or in his government, is Ayatollah Khomeini, who's an Islamic cleric, which is a term for a religious official, who led a revolution against Reza Shah and came to power in the 1980s. And part of this is that Reza Shah he was a puppet to the United States, and the people saw this. It's not what they wanted. The Iranian people are not anti-American, but they are strong and organized. You don't see many pictures of Iran, but it's well developed. It has well-functioning cities. It's compared to the Middle East, quite stable and doesn't have a great deal of poverty. And so the Iranians saw what relationships with the Americans did for other countries, and they didn't want that. They wanted to have their theocracy with a strong Islamic tradition. And so Ayatollah Khomeini was able to rally people against the United States and have a revolution against Reza Shah. And this represents a religious and cultural shift in Iran towards Islamic Sharia law. And this is a shift from the secular and political rule that characterized Iran in the past. So even Mossadegh, being and using Islam as a guide, he was not an extremist. And because the United States went in and put in Reza Shah, we created a more extremist movement in the opposite direction. People wanted to go oppose, what the United States had done. And so Ayatollah Khomeini is a much more extreme figure and leader. I should just add before going into South Africa that is, if you ever wondered why we're not friends with Iran, that is why, that we overthrew the leader that they had chosen and put in one that was more practical for us and more or less disrespected their sovereignty and their beliefs. So South Africa. You're asked to describe the apartheid system and its purpose. What was the role of the international community in the ending of apartheid? I believe that you read a novel last year related to apartheid and should be pretty familiar. But just a reminder too, because this came up earlier in the year, South Africa is a country, Africa is a continent. And so just to avoid it. So apartheid is a system of legal racial segregation in South Africa until 1994, which is pretty recent. So the United States had legal segregation until we had Roe versus Wade and separate but unequal that overturned that idea. But that was much longer ago. And so this continues on in South Africa. And to give you a little bit of an idea of what this looked like, it meant that blacks could only live in certain areas of South Africa. They were given the worst neighborhoods. They were given limited types of jobs and mistreated and had harsher and stricter laws than whites, very much like the 50s and 40s United States. The areas that they were forced to live in were taxed very heavily, so it's almost like sharecropping in a way, but a lot of the jobs that they were offered was working in mines and mining diamonds and gold, etc., and doing not the most favorable work for not very much money. And the apartheid leads to international protests, including ones by students on U.S. college campuses. This helped influence the end of apartheid. Notable individuals are Nelson Mandela, who hopefully you know of, and he was imprisoned for 27 years on Robben Island. It's just south of South Africa, and he later becomes the president of South Africa, and he preaches nonviolent resistance to apartheid and equality. Moving on to India. Post-colonial India has been described at different times as a partially successful democracy or the largest functioning democracy in the world. Lately, there have been reports of mass corruption in Indian democracy, but the idea is that they're trying, and they do have some obstacles that we do not, and so our democratic system would likely not work perfectly in India. Consider they have a division of religions and many different ethnicities, strong ethnicities represented in their country. And so you're asked to describe the tension between these two statements. Which one are you more likely to agree with and why? And so take a minute to think about that. You know, who decides what is a successful democracy? How do we know it's successful? So India is certainly the largest country in the world with democratically elected officials. However, literacy rates, public health, and education services remain significant challenges. Also, extreme poverty persists. So there are many what we might call shanty towns, or people not living in proper homes. There's a lot of issues with sanitation and waste removal. It's simply that it's hard for India to take care of the needs of its people as both a democratic and capitalist nation. And so they are working to find that balance. Similar to the United States, they have a very large wealth gap. And so this is the cause of some of these issues, that the rich don't want to give up their money to support these services, and they're trying to find a balance.